On a tense flight, Frank Delaney, a 78-year-old veteran, endures a businessman's scorn for taking legroom. Clara Jensen, a young woman in first class, notices his quiet dignity and swaps seats, giving him her luxurious spot. As whispers spread, a flight attendant reveals a stunning connection. Frank knew Clara's grandfather, Robert Jensen, who saved him from homelessness decades ago. The cabin buzzes with awe as passengers sense fate unfolding. What will happen when Frank and Clara meet? Will this ripple of kindness spark something greater? The plane hums with unspoken respect, hinting at a transformative moment. This story of kindness moved you. Now, share yours. Like, subscribe, and comment to keep decency alive. Support our channel to spread tales of honor and connection. Let's remind America what matters. Share this video with someone who believes small acts echo forever. Thank you for watching. On a crowded flight, the businessman's voice sliced through the cabin's hum, sharp and unapologetic. "That old man's blocking my legroom," he declared, his words loud enough to ripple across the economy section, a public shaming meant to assert his dominance. His sneer was a blade aimed at Frank Delaney, a 78-year-old veteran whose frame seemed to shrink under the accusation. Frank's response was a whisper, fragile yet deliberate, woven with an apology he didn't know. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, his voice barely rising above the drone of the engines, his body shifting in a futile attempt to make himself smaller. The cabin remained silent, passengers adhering to the unspoken rule of public spaces. Don't get involved. Eyes dropped to phones, hands adjusted earbuds, and the world moved on, except for one woman in first class. Clara Jensen sat in the cushioned luxury of seat 1A, her life a careful dance between visibility and restraint. Young, poised, she carried herself with the effortless grace of someone who could grace a magazine cover one day and blend into a crowd the next. But her heart was not so easily contained. She had noticed Frank the moment he boarded, his slow, purposeful steps drawing her attention like a quiet melody in a storm. His Navy cap, faded but proud, bore a Vietnam service pin that caught the cabin's dim light. To others, he was just another elderly passenger, unremarkable in the chaos of boarding. But Clara saw the details: the military duffel bag, a relic from an era before wheeled luggage, the crisp crease in his slacks, a testament to a discipline that hadn't faded, the silent ache in his shoulders, a weight she recognized from her grandfather. A man who had carried the same war's scars. Her grandfather had called it ghost weight, the invisible burden of memories too heavy to share, but too precious to release. The businessman's voice rang out again, sharper, more cutting. "Maybe you should have booked extra legroom, huh? I paid for this seat and I'm not spending 3 hours jammed against your knee." The words were a public verdict, and Frank's face flickered with a quiet pain, a shadow of recognition. He had seen this before, not in the jungles of Vietnam, but in the years since, in the way the world sometimes looked through him, as if his service, his sacrifices, were footnotes in someone else's story. "My legs," he murmured. "They don't fold like they used to." His hands, scarred and steady, rested on his lap, his duffel tucked neatly beneath his seat. He tried to shift again, his knees pressing against the seat in front, as if he could will his body to disappear. Clara's chest tightened, her grandfather's stories flooding back. Tales not of heroics, but of humanity, of moments that defined a man long after the war ended. She set her book down, her fingers trembling with the resolve she hadn't fully named. She pulled off her headphones, the cabin's noise rushing in, and reached for the call button. The flight attendant approached, her smile practiced but curious. "Miss Jensen, is something wrong?" she asked. Clara's gaze flicked to the curtain separating first class from economy, where the businessman's complaint still hung in the air. "No," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But something back there is. I'd like to change seats. Give him mine." The attendant hesitated, her professionalism faltering. "Who?" Clara pointed beyond the curtain. "That veteran. Switch us. I'll take his seat." In economy, the air was thick with tension, the businessman's irritation a palpable force. Frank sat still, his back hunched as far as his aging spine allowed, his Navy cap a quiet declaration of a life lived with purpose. As a former Navy senior officer, he had learned to read rooms before people, to observe silently and speak last. But this moment cut deeper than he expected. The businessman's words weren't just about space, they were a dismissal, a reminder that to some, his presence was a burden. He thought of the war, the heat, the fear, the friends who never came home. He thought of the promises he'd made to live quietly, to carry his burdens without complaint. And yet, here he was, apologizing for existing. When the flight attendant relayed Clara's offer, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. The businessman's complaints faded into a stunned silence, and Frank looked up, bewildered as he was guided to first class. His duffel clutched tightly, his steps slow but steady. He settled into the plush seat, its comfort foreign and almost overwhelming. He glanced at Clara, now in his cramped economy seat, her posture calm but her eyes alight with a kindness he hadn't expected. Hours later, the flight attendant leaned down to Clara, her voice a whisper that carried the weight of a revelation. "He knew your grandfather. He remembers." The words stole Clara's breath, her mind racing to connect the threads of a past she'd only known through stories. Frank, now in first class, felt the cabin's eyes on him. He stood, his voice steady despite the years, and spoke not of battles but of a man, Clara's grandfather, whose compassion had saved him in a moment of despair. The cabin listened, and one by one passengers rose, not in anger but in reverence, a silent, thunderous respect for a man who had carried his ghost with grace. Frank Delaney had flown countless times, his journeys crisscrossing the skies in a life marked by duty and quiet endurance. Never once had anyone remarked on the way his legs fidgeted, the subtle shifts of a body no longer as limber as it once was. But on this flight he felt like an intrusion, a man out of place in a world that seemed to have moved on without him. His knees, stiff from years of service, brushed against the seat in front, and the businessman beside him let out a faint huff of irritation. Frank's heart sank, a pang of embarrassment tightening his chest. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice softer this time, as if trying to shrink himself further. The businessman didn't respond. He'd already retreated into his own world, earbuds in, fingers swiping across a tablet, as if Frank's apology and Frank himself had vanished entirely. Frank leaned back, exhaling a slow, measured breath, his gaze drifting to the window. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet resolve, the kind honed by decades of sacrifices no one would ever notice. The sky outside stretched endlessly, a vast canvas that mirrored the weight of his thoughts. Then a gentle presence broke his reverie. The flight attendant approached, her steps careful, her voice soft, as if coaxing someone from a fragile dream. "Mr. Delaney," she said, her eyes kind but purposeful, "would you mind coming with me?" Frank's brow furrowed, a flicker of confusion passing through him. He hesitated, his hands gripping the armrests as if anchoring himself to the moment. "Why?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "We'd like to move you," she replied, her tone warm yet firm. "Miss Jensen has requested it." The words hung in the air, unfamiliar and disorienting. "Requested what?" "To switch seats with you," she clarified. Frank blinked, his mind racing to make sense of it. "I didn't ask for anything," he said, almost to himself. "I know," the attendant replied, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "She asked for you." He glanced around, suddenly aware of the subtle shift in the cabin. A few passengers were watching now, their gazes curious but silent. The businessman beside him remained oblivious, his focus locked on his screen. Frank rose slowly, his movements deliberate, carrying the grace of a man who'd never let age strip him of dignity, even if his joints protested. As he stepped into the aisle, the passengers seemed to part for him, their murmurs fading into a respectful hush. He didn't understand what was unfolding, but in that quiet, something stirred, a ripple of something larger, like the echo of boots on a parade ground, or the lingering resonance of a salute that transcended time and uniform. Clara Jensen looked up as he approached her seat. Her eyes held no expectation, no demand for acknowledgement. She simply stepped aside, gesturing to seat 1A with a quiet nod, a gesture so understated it felt profound. For now, that was enough. Frank's chest tightened, a mix of gratitude and unease swirling within him. He hadn't sat in first class since 1984, and even then it was a fluke, a last-minute upgrade on a half-empty military flight to D.C. That had been a clerical quirk, a fleeting moment of comfort in a life of service. But this was intentional, and that made it heavier, harder to accept. He lowered himself into the seat cautiously, as if it might dissolve beneath him if he settled too quickly. The leather was impossibly soft, the legroom a luxury that felt almost absurd after years of cramming his frame into economy. A crisp white cloth draped the tray table, and a bottle of water stood waiting, its condensation glinting in the cabin light. The attendant appeared again, offering a warm towel. Frank stared at it, his fingers hovering as if unsure whether to touch it. He hadn't seen a towel like this on a plane since the days when airlines still handed out peanuts. His eyes flicked to the young woman now seated in his former place in economy. Clara Jensen, the attendant had whispered. She didn't look back. She simply opened her book, her posture calm, as if the act of giving up her seat was as natural as breathing. To her, perhaps it was just a small gesture, a fleeting act of kindness. To Frank, it was a crack in the armor he had worn for years, a moment that threatened to unravel the stoicism he'd carried through decades of unseen battles. "Is it your first time in first class?" The voice beside him was warm, pulling him from his thoughts. A tall, silver-haired man in a blazer leaned slightly toward him, a friendly smile softening his weathered face. He carried the air of someone who'd flown so often that the skies held no more surprises. Frank adjusted the navy cap on his head, a faint chuckle escaping despite himself. "Is it that obvious?" he replied, glancing at the towel still clutched in his hands like it might betray him. "Not really," the man said, his eyes twinkling. "But you're holding that towel like it's a live grenade." Frank laughed, the sound surprising even himself, a rare release of tension. "Yeah, a bit out of my element," he admitted, setting the towel down as if surrendering to the moment. "Welcome then," the man said, extending a hand. "Charles Whitmore, retired judge. I take this flight every other month." Frank shook his hand, his grip firm, steady. "Frank Delaney, retired Navy. I don't fly much anymore. Only when it matters." He paused, the weight of his words settling between them. "Family." Charles nodded, understanding flickering in his gaze. "That's a good reason. What's the occasion?" Frank's eyes softened, a quiet pride surfacing. "My granddaughter's graduation. Northwestern, first in our family to get a college degree." His voice caught slightly, and he cleared his throat, glancing out the window to steady himself. "She called me last year, crying about finals. Thought she wouldn't make it. I told her, 'You finish what you started, kiddo. That's what we do.' Promised her I'd be there." Charles smiled, his expression warm but tinged with respect. "And now you are." Frank swallowed hard, his gaze drifting toward the back of the plane where the curtain hid Clara from view. "Thanks to that young woman, Mom," he said quietly, the words heavy with gratitude and something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. Charles followed his gaze, then leaned back, thoughtful. After a moment, he spoke again, his tone gentle. "Mind if I ask about the hat?" Frank touched the brim of his navy cap, his fingers tracing the familiar stitching. "Vietnam," he said simply, and later Desert Storm. "I was 19 the first time I deployed, 31 when I came home the second time." His voice was steady, but his eyes held the weight of memories too vast to share in a single conversation. Charles nodded, his expression sobering. "You saw both ends of it then." Frank's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze distant. "More than most," he said softly, the words carrying the echo of jungles and deserts, of youth lost and resilience gained. The cabin hummed around them, but in that moment, it was just two men, one carrying the weight of a nation's wars, the other bearing witness to a story that deserved to be heard. Frank Delaney's voice carried a weight that seemed to settle into the recycled air of the airplane cabin, each word deliberate, as if he'd polished them over years of quiet reflection. "More times than I care to count," he said, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the small oval window, where clouds drifted like ghosts against an endless sky. "And fewer than I wish people would bother to remember." His tone wasn't bitter, but it held the ache of someone who'd learned to carry pain without letting it define him. Charles Whitmore, seated beside him in the plush first-class seat, tilted his head, his expression soft but piercing, as if he could see straight through to the heart of Frank's words. He understood, not in some abstract way, but with the kind of knowing that comes from having brushed up against life's sharper edges. "Must have been tough coming back," Charles said, his voice low, inviting rather than probing. Frank nodded, his movements slow, almost reverent, as if acknowledging a truth too heavy to rush. "Tougher than the war itself," he admitted. "You go out there, you're ready for chaos. You brace for it. But coming home, nobody prepares you for the silence. You don't expect ticker tape parades or medals pinned to your chest, but you sure as hell don't expect people to cross the street just to avoid looking at you. Or worse, spitting in your direction like you're some kind of stain." His voice held steady, a practiced calm, forged through years of retelling this story, not for pity but for clarity, for the faint hope that speaking the truth might lighten the load for someone else down the line. "I was homeless for 2 years, Portland, of all places. Slept under a bridge near Burnside with the rain soaking through my coat and the wind cutting like a knife. People would pass by, and you could see it in their eyes the way they'd pretend you weren't there. Like if they didn't look, you didn't exist." Charles leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped, his silence an invitation for Frank to keep going. "How'd you pull yourself out of it?" he asked, not out of curiosity, but with a kind of respect, as if he knew the answer would carry weight. Frank's lips curved into a faint smile, one that held more gratitude than joy. He hesitated, not out of doubt, but because the memory deserved care. "There was this guy," he began, his voice softening, "a hardware store owner. Found me one winter night, curled up in his shop's doorway, shivering so hard I thought my bones would crack. He didn't call the cops or shoo me away. Instead, he brought me a cup of coffee, hot, black, no sugar, just the way I liked it back when I could afford to have preferences. A week later, he offered me a job, sweeping floors, stocking shelves, nothing fancy. Let me sleep in the back room until I could stand on my own 2 feet again. Got me clean, not just from the dirt, but from the bottle I'd been drowning in." Charles raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "That's rare," he said simply, and it wasn't judgment, just an acknowledgement of how uncommon such kindness was. "Yeah," Frank agreed, his voice almost a whisper now. "He didn't treat me like some charity case, like a project to fix so he could pat himself on the back. He treated me like a man, like I still had something worth offering." He paused, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest, a rhythm born of restless memory. "We stayed friends for years after that. His name was Robert Jensen." The name slipped out softly like a prayer, and Frank's gaze drifted back to the window. "Ran a little shop on Fremont, had a son, a granddaughter. Little thing, maybe this tall," he said, holding his hand at knee height, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Never asked for a dime in return. Just believed I wasn't done yet, that there was still something left in me worth saving." The name, Robert Jensen, hung in the air like the echo of a bell, reverberating in the quiet space between them. Charles didn't speak, didn't need to. He could feel the shift in Frank's voice, the way it deepened, like a tide pulling back to reveal something sacred beneath the surface. Frank's story wasn't just about survival, it was about redemption, about the kind of human connection that could tether a man back to himself when the world had tried to strip him bare. In the back of the plane, Clara Jensen sat in her cramped economy seat, her knees brushing against the plastic tray table in front of her. The discomfort had faded into the background, overshadowed by the storm of emotions swirling in her chest. Her hands gripped the edges of a paperback she hadn't read a word of in the last 10 minutes, her eyes fixed on the seat back in front of her, unseeing. She'd felt the weight of the businessman's stare earlier, the one who'd grumbled about her taking his seat in the swap that landed her here. His irritation had been palpable, but now he sat quieter, his posture softened, as if the air around him had shifted. He didn't speak, didn't complain anymore, and Clara noticed the extra inch of space he'd subtly given her, like an unspoken truce. She wasn't looking for gratitude, not from him or anyone. But the shift in his demeanor hadn't gone unnoticed. The flight attendant passed by, her steps light, professional, then paused and doubled back. She leaned down, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. Miss Jensen, his name is Frank Delaney, she said, her eyes bright with something like wonder. The man I switched your seat with? He's telling a story up there about someone named Robert Jensen. Said your grandfather helped him when he was homeless. Clara's breath caught, sharp and sudden, as if the air had been sucked out of the cabin. The book slipped from her lap, landing with a soft thud on the floor. Are you sure? She whispered, her voice trembling, barely audible over the hum of the plane's engines. The attendant nodded, her expression gentle but certain. And in that moment, something broke open inside Clara. It wasn't just surprise or coincidence. It was a tidal wave of realization crashing through the carefully constructed walls she'd built around her heart. This wasn't just a story. This wasn't just kindness. This was her grandfather's legacy, reaching across time and space to touch her here in the middle of a routine flight, in a way she could never have imagined. Her chest tightened, her eyes stinging with tears she didn't want to let fall. Not here, not in front of strangers. But the weight of it was overwhelming, like the plane itself had tilted, not in any physical sense, but as if the universe had shifted its course to bring her to this moment. Clara's mind raced, memories of her grandfather flooding back with vivid clarity. Robert Jensen had been a quiet man, his hands calloused from years of working with tools, his heart steady and unassuming. He'd never spoken of his kindnesses, never boasted about the lives he'd touched. If it's real, he used to say, his voice low and firm, you don't need credit for it. She'd always admired that about him, the way he carried himself with a quiet strength, building things, shelves, homes, lives, with the same care and precision. But now, hearing his name spoken by a stranger, woven into a story of salvation, Clara realized there was so much more to him than she'd ever known. Her grandfather hadn't just helped a man, he'd changed the course of a life, and in doing so he'd left a piece of himself in the world, a legacy that had found its way back to her. She glanced down the aisle toward the curtain separating economy from first class. She couldn't see Frank Delaney, but she could feel his presence, like a thread connecting her to a past she'd only partially understood. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with something deeper, a sense of purpose, of connection, of something sacred unfolding in the mundane hum of this flight. She wanted to stand, to walk up there, to see the man whose life her grandfather had touched. But her body felt anchored to the seat, her hands trembling as they clutched the armrests. This wasn't just a story. This was her history, her family, her blood, coming full circle in a way that felt almost divine. Up front, Frank continued, unaware of the storm he'd unwittingly stirred in the back of the plane. Charles's question had been simple, but his quiet, respectful listening had unlocked something in Frank, a door he'd kept closed for years. I didn't start drinking until I got back, he said, his voice low, steady, but laced with a rawness that hadn't faded with time. You'd think the war would have pushed me there, bullets, bombs, the things you see that don't leave you. But it wasn't that. It was the silence after, the way the world just moved on. Like you were supposed to slip back into it, like nothing had changed, when everything inside you was different. He shook his head, a faint chuckle escaping, though there was no humor in it. Lost my job 6 months after I got back. Then the apartment, then my marriage. Kept thinking, this can't be it. This can't be what I fought for. But it was. For a while it was. Charles nodded, his silence a steady presence, giving Frank the space to unravel the story at his own pace. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity, just a quiet understanding that made Frank feel seen in a way he hadn't in years. And so he kept going, letting the words spill out. Not for himself, but for the man who'd believed in him when he'd forgotten how to believe in himself. Robert Jensen's name lingered in his mind, a beacon of light in a story that could have ended in darkness. And as he spoke, he felt the weight of that kindness settle into him again. Not as a debt, but as a gift, one he was passing on in his own way by telling the truth. In the back, Clara sat frozen, her heart a tangle of awe and grief and pride. The plane droned on, carrying them all toward their destination. But for her, the journey had already changed. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was the granddaughter of a man who'd built more than shelves, who'd mended more than tools. She was part of something bigger, something that stretched beyond her, beyond this moment, into a legacy she was only beginning to understand. And as the plane cut through the sky, she felt it, a shift, deep and unshakable, like the world had tilted just enough to let her see it anew. The scar on Frank's knuckle glimmered faintly under the dim cabin light, a jagged reminder of a night when glass had bitten into his skin. He rubbed it absent-mindedly, his fingers tracing the rough edge, as if it could pull him back to that moment under the Portland Bridge. "This isn't the ending I thought I'd get," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent wrestling with fate. "Portland winters don't give a damn about your medals or your past. You either find a way to keep warm or you don't." His eyes drifted, unfocused, as if he could still feel the icy wind cutting through his threadbare coat, the damp concrete beneath him, the hollow ache of wondering how he'd ended up so far from the man he used to be. Frank's words hung in the air, and Charles, seated beside him in the plush first-class cabin, listened with a quiet intensity. Frank didn't notice the way Charles straightened at the mention of a name, a subtle shift in posture that betrayed recognition. Frank was too lost in the memory, his voice low but steady, pulling him back to that night when everything changed. "I was squatting under that bridge, trying to make myself smaller against the cold, wondering what the hell I'd done to deserve this. Then Robert Jensen found me." His lips curved into the ghost of a smile, the kind that comes from gratitude so deep it hurts. He didn't ask questions, didn't look at me like I was some broken thing. Just handed me a clean mug, not some flimsy paper cup, but a real ceramic one, warm with coffee. Sat down beside me like I was somebody worth sitting next to. Told me I didn't look like a man who was finished. I told him he was wrong, that I was done for. He didn't argue, just gave me his card and said to come by in the morning. Frank's gaze drifted to the window where clouds stretched like spun cotton over the world below, soft and endless. "It wasn't charity," he said, his voice firm as if defending Robert's memory from being reduced to something so small. "It was a ladder, a way up. He let me sweep floors at his shop, then trusted me with the register. Let me sleep in the storage room until I could afford a place of my own. Said I reminded him of his brother, the one who never made it back from Korea." The words caught in his throat, and for a moment he was back in that cramped storage room, the smell of sawdust and old books grounding him, giving him something to hold on to when he'd had nothing left. Charles didn't speak, but his silence wasn't empty. His eyes, steady and searching, bore witness to Frank's story, to the raw truth of a man who'd been pulled from the edge by a stranger's kindness. Frank's voice softened, almost reverent. "That man saved my life. Made me believe I was still Frank, not a failure, not a headline, just a man with a name and a purpose." Charles leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but deliberate. "Did he ever ask for anything in return?" Frank let out a low chuckle, the sound warm with affection. "Only that I helped the next guy when it was my turn. That was Robert. Never about him, always about what you could do for someone else." Frank's eyes flicked to the window again, then back to Charles. "And now his granddaughter, can you believe it? She gave me this seat, this first-class ticket, just because I was here, just because I existed." His voice trembled with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. Charles tilted his head, curious. "You know she's his granddaughter?" Frank shook his head, a small, wistful smile tugging at his lips. "No, not for sure, just a feeling." She's got his eyes, quiet, steady, like she's carrying something strong and to her, something that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Behind them, a flight attendant lingered near the galley, her tray of drinks forgotten. She'd been making her rounds, offering water and wine, but now she stood still, caught in the gravity of Frank's story. His words, soft but piercing, had begun to ripple through the cabin. Whispers moved from seat to seat, passenger to passenger, like a current no one could see but everyone could feel. "Did you hear about the veteran in first class?" one woman murmured to her seatmate. "He said the girl's grandfather helped him years ago." Another voice, low and awed, added, "It's like fate or something. Her grandfather saved his life." In the back of the plane, Clara sat in her economy seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The flight attendant approached her row, crouching low, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's still talking up there," she said, her mind bright with emotion. "Told the whole story. mentioned your grandfather's name, Robert Jensen. Clara's breath caught, her throat tightening as if the air had suddenly thickened. Robert Jensen. Her grandfather. The man who'd been gone for 5 years, whose odd absence still felt like a hole in her chest. She'd missed him every single day, his warm laugh, his quiet wisdom, the way he'd made everyone around him feel seen. And now here was this stranger, this veteran in first class, carrying a piece of her grandfather's legacy like a torch through the dark. Clara's heart pounded, a rush of emotions crashing over her. Grief, pride, wonder. She wanted to cry, to let the tears spill over for the grandfather she'd lost. She wanted to run up the aisle, to find this man and hug him, to thank him for keeping her grandfather's memory alive. Instead, she pressed her lips together, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "Thank you," to the flight attendant. Her gaze drifted to the window where the clouds glowed faintly in the fading light. Her grandfather was gone, but in this moment, through Frank's story, he felt alive again, his kindness echoing across years and miles, touching lives she'd never known about. Back in first class, Frank folded his hands in his lap, his fingers brushing the scar on his knuckle once more. "I never got to thank him properly," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I always wished I could have told his family what he did for me." Charles raised an eyebrow, his gaze flickering toward the back of the plane. "Maybe," he said softly, "you still can." The seatbelt sign glowed above them, but the stillness in the cabin had nothing to do with turbulence. From row 2 to row 32, the passengers on flight 214 were no longer just strangers sharing a plane. They were bound together, reluctant at first, then captivated by a story that wove them into something larger. It had started with a whisper, a kind act, a quiet veteran, a young woman who'd given up her seat for a stranger. Then the connection. Robert Jensen. That name was the spark, igniting something none of them could fully explain, but all of them felt. The story spread seat by seat, voice by voice, like wind rustling through a field of wheat. "Wait, you mean the guy in first class knew her grandfather?" one passenger murmured. "He said Robert saved his life," another replied, eyes wide. "No way. That girl's his granddaughter?" By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the story had taken on a life of its own, passed along not through screens or posts, but through the old-fashioned transmission of human connection. Emotion, reverence. The flight attendants, usually brisk and efficient, moved slower now, their own eyes glistening as they overheard fragments of the tale. The cabin hummed with a quiet magic, a shared understanding that something extraordinary had unfolded, and they were all part of it. On the plane, the atmosphere shifted subtly, like a breeze changing direction. The flight attendants moved with a newfound deliberateness, their steps slower, more purposeful, as if each gesture carried weight. They exchanged quiet glances with one another, their eyes flickering with something unspoken. Empathy, perhaps, or a shared understanding. Passengers, too, seemed to sense the shift, offering gentle nods as the crew passed by. A quiet kindness had settled over the aircraft, softening the usual hum of impatience and routine. It was as if the plane itself had exhaled, releasing tension no one had realized was there. In the plush cocoon of first class, Frank Delaney sat motionless, his hands resting on a neatly folded towel in his lap. The story he'd shared earlier, raw and unpolished, now hung in the air like a confession he couldn't take back. He hadn't meant to draw attention, hadn't intended for his words to ripple through the cabin the way they had. His chest tightened as he replayed the moment, the weight of it sinking deeper. He hadn't even known her name until a flight attendant, her voice hushed with reverence, had whispered it to him. Clara Jensen. The woman who'd given up her seat without hesitation, without knowing the man she was helping or the history she was unknowingly honoring. Frank's breath caught, a sharp hitch that startled him. "You're sure she didn't know who I was either?" he asked, his voice low, almost pleading. The attendant nodded, her eyes soft but certain. Clara Jensen, Robert's granddaughter. The name struck him like a chord, reverberating through memories he'd long buried. Robert Jensen, the man who'd seen him at his lowest, a broken figure in the gutter, and extended a hand instead of a judgment. A man who'd offered to buy a cup of coffee, a chance to rebuild when the world had written Frank off. Now, decades later, Robert's granddaughter had, without knowing it, paid tribute to her grandfather's legacy by extending that same quiet grace to Frank. He pressed his fingers to his temples, trying to steady the storm of emotions swirling inside him. The moment felt vast, too big for words, like a debt he could never repay, but would carry forever. Back in economy, Clara sat still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on nothing. The hum of the plane faded into the background as her mind drifted far from the cramped cabin. She hadn't spoken since the attendant confirmed the story. Her thoughts tangled in a past she'd only glimpsed through her grandfather's stories and silences. The man seated beside her, who'd earlier been sharp-tongued and restless, now sat in awkward silence. He shifted in his seat, his eyes darting anywhere but toward her. Perhaps it was guilt for his earlier impatience, or shame for how he'd dismissed her gesture. But Clara barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, decades back, in the dim light of her grandfather's hardware store. She could see him now, standing behind the counter, handing a steaming cup of coffee to a man with weary eyes and a stubborn pride that refused to break. She hadn't understood then why her grandfather lingered so long by the store's front window, staring out at the street with a quiet intensity, or why he bristled at words like bum when others spoke of the homeless. He'd always insisted on second chances, even when the world turned its back. A memory flickered, a faded photograph she'd found years ago, taped to the back of a dusty toolbox in the garage. Two men stood shoulder to shoulder in front of a shop, its crooked sign reading, Jensen and Company, Repairs, Tools, Trust. She'd never known who the second man was. The one with the proud stance and the faint smile. Not until now, the realization hit her like a wave, her heart aching with the weight of it. Her grandfather had never boasted about his kindness, never made a show of the lives he'd touched. But here, on this plane, the echoes of his compassion had found her, binding her to a stranger in a way she could scarcely comprehend. 10 minutes later, the curtain separating first class from economy fluttered open. Frank Delaney stood at the threshold, his silhouette framed by the soft light of the cabin. He didn't move immediately, his hands smoothing the brim of his navy cap, adjusting the lapels of his jacket with a care that spoke of habit, of discipline. His legs trembled slightly, betraying his age, but his posture was unyielding. A soldier's stance, forged in formations long ago and salutes to commanders in storms that didn't always relent. Now he was stepping into a different kind of battle, one of gratitude and vulnerability, facing rows of strangers who had become silent witnesses to something extraordinary. He moved down the aisle with measured steps, his eyes scanning the faces around him. No one spoke. No one needed to. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation. Then something remarkable happened. One by one, passengers rose from their seats, not out of obligation or curiosity, but out of something deeper, something primal. Respect. Heads nodded, eyes softened, and the narrow aisle seemed to widen as people stepped aside, making way for the old man whose story had touched them all. By the time Frank reached row 17, more than half the cabin was standing, their silence a chorus of shared reverence. Clara stood too, her heart pounding as she turned to face him. She wasn't sure whether to smile or let the tears welling in her eyes spill over. The man before her looked like he'd lived 100 lives, his face lined with the weight of years, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his eyes were clear, piercing, locked on her as if she were the only person in the world. He extended his hand, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Miss Jensen," he said, the words carrying a quiet strength, "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did." Clara shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't anything," she said, the words catching in her throat. She felt small, overwhelmed by the moment, by the man standing before her. "No," Frank replied, his voice gentle but firm. "It was everything." He paused, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to convey a lifetime of gratitude in a single moment. "Your grandfather saved my life. You gave me the chance to thank him." Clara's breath caught, her chest tightening. "I never knew," she said, her voice trembling. "He never told me." Frank nodded, a slow, knowing gesture. "That sounds like Robert," he said softly. He didn't need to speak his kindness. He lived it. The cabin around them fell into a sacred silence, the kind that feels like time itself has paused to bear witness. Then, from somewhere near the front, A single pair of hands began to clap. Another joined, then another, until the sound swelled into a rolling tide of applause. Not loud or showy, but deep, resonant, a quiet thunder of respect. No speeches were made, no cameras flashed, just a plane full of people. Strangers bound by a fleeting moment of grace, realizing they'd witnessed something rare and good. In the heart of it stood two people, no longer strangers, connected by a thread of kindness that had stretched across decades, weaving through time until it found its way back home. As the plane's wheels kissed the tarmac in Chicago, a hushed reverence enveloped the cabin. The story had rippled through every row, whispered from seat to seat, shared in quiet tones by neighbors, flight attendants, or those who'd seen it unfold with their own eyes. Yet, when the seatbelt sign chimed off, no one leapt to their feet. No one scrambled for overhead bins or pushed toward the aisle. Instead, passengers lingered in their seats, not out of obligation, but out of a shared sense of something holy. To rush would have been to shatter the delicate sanctity of what they'd witnessed, a moment too profound to be trampled by haste. Frank Delaney rose first, his movements slow and deliberate, as if each step carried the weight of decades. His weathered hands trembled slightly, not from age but from the flood of emotions he could barely contain. Clara Jensen stood beside him, her posture soft but steady, her eyes reflecting a quiet strength. Their rise wasn't planned, yet it felt as choreographed as a sacred ritual. As they began their walk toward the front of the plane, the sea of passengers parted once more. This time, it wasn't curiosity that cleared the path, but a deep, unspoken respect. Some fumbled for their phones, tempted to capture the moment, but many resisted, sensing that recording it might diminish its purity. Tears glistened in the eyes of strangers. Others offered silent nods, their faces etched with gratitude for being part of something so human. When Frank and Clara stepped off the jet bridge into the terminal, a sudden burst of camera flashes greeted them. The story had somehow outrun the plane, spreading like wildfire through the airport. A small cluster of journalists waited near the gate, their microphones thrust forward, their producers wide-eyed with anticipation. "Miss Jensen, is it true you gave up your seat?" one called out. "Mr. Delaney, how do you feel about all this attention? Were you really saved by her grandfather?" The questions came fast, sharp, and unrelenting, but Clara didn't falter. She kept walking, her pace gentle but resolute, her hand resting lightly on Frank's back as if to shield him from the onslaught. Her touch was instinctive, a quiet promise that he wouldn't face this alone. One reporter, more persistent than the rest, pressed closer, his voice eager. "Will you be posting about this?" Clara paused, turning to face him. Her eyes, soft yet piercing, held his gaze for a moment before she spoke. "No," she said, her voice low but clear, carrying the weight of conviction. "This wasn't about content. It was about connection." Then with a firmness that brooked no argument, she added, "Please respect that." The cameras hesitated, then slowly lowered, as if her words had reminded the reporters of a decency they'd momentarily forgotten. The crowd parted, and Clara and Frank continued on, leaving the frenzy behind. Later that evening, Clara found herself at Northwestern University, seated beside Frank in the bleachers at his granddaughter Melissa's graduation. She hadn't planned to be there. The invitation had come unexpectedly, born from a tearful plea in Frank's eyes as they stood in the terminal. His voice had trembled with a quiet dignity that made refusal impossible. "Would you come?" he'd asked, and Clara, her heart swelling with an unfamiliar warmth, had nodded. Now dressed in jeans and a simple sweater, she sat tucked beside him, unnoticed by the crowd. Not because her fame as an Olympic athlete had faded, but because, for the first time in a long time, she felt she was exactly where she belonged. No spotlight, no podium, just the quiet comfort of shared humanity. As Melissa crossed the stage, her cap adorned with tassels, she waved toward the bleachers, her smile radiant. Frank's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. She did it. First one in the family. His words carried a lifetime of sacrifice, of nights spent worrying, of dreams he'd poured into his granddaughter's future. Clara reached for his hand, her grip warm and steady. "Not the last," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet certainty that made Frank's eyes glisten. In that moment, they weren't strangers bound by a fleeting act of kindness. They were family, woven together by something deeper than blood. That night in Frank's modest living room on the outskirts of Chicago, Clara experienced a moment she would carry for the rest of her life. The room was small, cluttered with memories. A worn armchair, a shelf of faded books, a framed photo of Melissa as a child. Frank disappeared briefly, returning with a tattered photo album cradled in his hands like a sacred relic. He opened it to a page that stole Clara's breath. There, in faded color, was a younger Frank, his eyes hollow but hopeful, standing beside a man with a thick mustache clutching a mug of coffee. Clara's heart stuttered. "That's my grandfather," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Robert Jensen." Frank nodded, his gaze distant, as if he were seeing the past unfold before him. "That's the photo from the garage," he said, his voice thick with reverence. "He let me sleep in the back of his shop when I had nowhere else to go. Taught me how to sand down doubt, how to keep going when everything felt broken." His fingers brushed the photo, tracing the edges with care. He used to say most broken things just need time and hands that don't give up. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she reached out, her fingertips grazing the image of her grandfather. She'd known he was kind, but she'd never known this story. "He never told me," she said, her voice barely audible. Frank's gaze met hers, steady and sure. "The best men don't. They just do." By morning, the story had exploded across the internet. A passenger Clara had never noticed, seated somewhere in the back of the plane, had posted about it. An Olympic athlete giving up her first-class seat for a veteran who'd once been homeless. A man whose life had been changed by her grandfather's kindness decades earlier. The post ended with a simple observation. No speech, no cameras, just decency. The whole plane stood in silence. Within hours, it had been shared over 400,000 times. Morning news anchors dissected it with earnest tones. Veteran groups reposted it with pride. Airlines issued statements about honoring uniformed veterans with upgrades when possible. The world seemed to pause, if only for a moment, to celebrate something pure. But Clara remained silent. She didn't issue a press release or sit for interviews. She didn't turn the moment into a brand or a platform. Instead, she posted a single sentence on her social media. "Kindness isn't a performance. It's a continuation." Then she logged off, retreating from the noise to protect the sanctity of what had happened. She didn't need the world's validation. She'd felt it in Frank's trembling hand, in the quiet dignity of his gratitude. Weeks later, a handwritten letter arrived at Frank's home, its envelope bearing an Ohio postmark. It was from a young man who'd seen the viral post. "My grandfather served too," he wrote, his words shaky but sincere. "He died alone, thinking nobody remembered. Your story helped me understand that remembrance isn't always about medals. It's about moments. Thank you for reminding me." More letters followed, each one a testament to the ripple effect of a single act. Some came from veterans who'd felt forgotten, others from grandchildren who vowed to carry on their family's legacy, and still others from strangers who'd been on different flights, now pausing to notice the man in uniform or the woman with a story etched in her eyes. Through it all, Clara and Frank carried the moment quietly, not as a headline but as a connection that had changed them both. For Clara, it was a reminder of her grandfather's legacy, a call to live with the same unassuming decency. For Frank, it was a debt repaid, a chance to stand tall not just for himself, but for the man who'd given him a second chance. Together, they'd woven a story that didn't belong to them alone. It belonged to everyone who'd witnessed it, everyone who'd been moved by it, everyone who'd ever believed that a single act of kindness could echo through generations. In the stillness of Frank's gaze, there was a story that lingered, unspoken but heavy with meaning. For Clara, the shift in her world didn't come from flashing lights or bold headlines, but from a quiet transformation deep within her heart. She found herself drawn to a small nonprofit dedicated to helping veterans rebuild their lives and step back into the workforce. There were no grand gestures or public declarations, just long, earnest hours spent poring over resumes, refining cover letters, and most importantly, listening. She sat with men and women like Frank, absorbing their tales of courage, loss, and resilience, each story a thread in the tapestry of their lives. To one weary veteran, his eyes clouded with doubt, she offered words that came from a place of conviction. You're not lost. You're just waiting for the right hands to find you and lift you up. Those words, simple yet profound, carried a promise that someone still believed in him. Clara's work was fueled by a fire that burned quietly but fiercely. She thought often of her grandfather, Robert Jensen, a man whose legacy wasn't carved in stone or celebrated in history books, but lived in the small, deliberate acts of kindness he extended to others. Frank's story in particular had rooted itself in her soul. She could picture him as he must have been decades ago, young, proud, yet burdened by the weight of war. She imagined the moment her grandfather, a stranger then, had offered him a cup of coffee and a conversation that restored a piece of his dignity. That single act had rippled across time, touching Clara's life and guiding her to this moment. She felt a responsibility to carry that kindness forward, not for applause or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Each resume she helped craft, each story she listened to, was her way of honoring not just Frank, but every veteran who had ever felt forgotten. The nonprofit's first annual benefit dinner was a modest affair, held in a community hall with folding chairs and paper tablecloths. But to those in attendance, it was a moment of profound connection. Frank, now older, his hair silvered and his hands steadied by time, was the guest of honor. Clara watched him from the side of the room, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. When he stepped up to the microphone, the crowd hushed. Frank's eyes swept over the faces before him, some familiar, some strangers, and he cleared his throat, the sound raw and deliberate. His voice, when he spoke, was steady but laced with emotion. "Robert Jensen once gave me back my dignity," he said, pausing as the weight of the memory settled over him. "His granddaughter gave me a chance to return the favor." The words hung in the air, simple yet powerful, a testament to the quiet strength of human connection. Frank turned to Clara then, his smile soft but radiant, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. In that moment, Clara felt the full weight of her grandfather's legacy, not as a burden, but as a gift. She thought of how legacies aren't about being etched into history or shouted from rooftops. They're about ensuring someone else's story is remembered, their worth seen and celebrated. Frank's words stirred something in her, a reminder that kindness, when given freely, can echo across generations, but only if we choose to let it. She felt a quiet resolve to keep that echo alive, to continue this work not for glory, but for the people who needed it most. The story of Clara and Frank began on a plane, in a fleeting moment that could have passed unnoticed. A seat change, a small act of courtesy, had set in motion a chain of events that neither could have predicted. No medals were pinned, no articles lingered in the news cycle, but between the hum of takeoff and the gentle thud of landing, something had shifted. The world hadn't changed because someone was larger than life, or because a single act was monumental. It changed because Clara chose to see Frank clearly, his pain, his pride, his humanity, without judgment or expectation. That choice, so simple yet so rare, was enough to carry the weight of the past into a brighter future. In a world that races forward, where stories flash across screens and vanish just as quickly, it's easy to overlook the quiet souls who carry heavy burdens. A seat offered on a plane, a cup of coffee shared decades ago, a young woman's decision to listen and act. They seemed like nothing at the time, but together they wove a legacy, a reminder that in America, honoring heroes isn't confined to holidays or ceremonies. It's in the way we treat one another every single day. Frank never sought the spotlight. His life was a testament to resilience, not fanfare. Clara didn't chase attention. Her work was driven by a deep-seated belief that every person deserves to be seen. Their story, though unassuming, held a truth that resonated far beyond their own lives. Respect isn't won through loud gestures, but through the steady rhythm of quiet decency repeated over time. Their story was a call to notice the small moments that hold the power to change a life. It was a reminder that legacies are built not by those who demand to be remembered, but by those who help others find their place in the world. In the end, Clara and Frank's lives intertwined to show that even in a world that feels louder and faster every day, the quiet acts of kindness are the ones that endure, carrying the past forward into a future where decency still matters.